Mother, man.
Spreading faster than a case of the clap in a trailer court. Able to shatter eardrums within a 666-mile radius. A podcast more brutal than all the rest. It's Murder Metal Mayhem!
Death of a Resurrection Man. Written and narrated by Pete Altieri. Resurrectionist, noun, a person who brings something to life or view again, a believer in resurrection. Also called resurrection man, a person who exhumes and steals dead bodies, especially for dissection, body snatcher. Part 1. The resurrection men would be dead in less than 5 minutes. Dr. J. Montague Goolsbee and his 2 accomplices were surrounded by a torch-lit angry mob, armed with clubs and an assortment of sharp objects, at Pittsmore Cemetery in Sheffield, England. No one would hear their screams as friends and relatives of the recently deceased beat, hacked, and stabbed the 3 of them to death under a full moon in the small hours of October 31st, 1826. The following is an account of what led these men to their deaths. Part 2. Dr. Goolsbee was a difficult person to like. As a baby and young child, he seldom drew the love and affection of others who felt uneasy around the strange boy. He was born James Montague Goolsbee, but went by his first initial and middle name instead. Even as a young boy, he would correct anyone who called him Jimmy or Monty. He would wag his finger at them in a mocking way when telling them his name was J. Montague Goolsbee. No one found it cute, but instead quite disdainful. He was the only child of Reginald and Emma Goolsbee of Rotherham, Yorkshire. Reginald was a secondary school teacher, and they raised their son in a typical middle-class English household of the late 1700s. He excelled in his studies, but was never able to gain a single friend, spending most of his free time reading or conducting scientific experiments. His parents thought it was odd, but figured eventually the young boy would grow out of this awkward stage. They made multiple failed attempts to get their son to socialize with other children. They tried to win the strange boy over with a puppy and later a kitten, but he shunned both animals intensely. He even tried to kill the cat twice before they gave it away. Nothing seemed to work. His mother often cried herself to sleep over it. As a teenager, the odd and peculiar little boy became an even stranger adolescent. His pockmarked, gaunt face with round spectacles made him appear more like an undertaker's apprentice than the doctor his parents wished he would become. J. Montague wore a black suit, white button-up shirt, and red tie every day from the moment he awoke until the time he went to bed. He spit-shined his shoes every Sunday night to be ready for the week. He had an oddly deep voice for someone his age, as if he were a smoker after years of abusing his lungs. He was 6 feet tall at 16 and as thin as a cornstalk, with knobby knees and a slight hunch in his upper back from a spinal condition he developed at birth. He certainly had a face only a mother could love, but even Emma Goolsbee had concerns for her only child. She wanted her front yard to be filled with grandchildren playing outside, but with only J. Montague Goolsbee to sire those children, she feared she would never see that come to pass. She would be correct in her concerns. Despite his obvious physical misfortunes and peculiar personality, J. Montague Goolsbee finished at the top of his class in grades and height at 6 foot 4 inches. He also had a perfect attendance and was accepted to the University of Sheffield, where he excelled in all his classes. Upon graduation, J. Montague went on to their acclaimed medical school and finished at the top of his class. His professors found him strange, but were in awe of his abilities. His classmates kept their distance and did their best to avoid him at all costs. J. Montague didn't mind at all because he preferred to be by himself. Unfortunately, his mother died the summer before he officially became a medical doctor, but his father, Reginald, was very proud of his son that he had achieved his goal. He wished his son would find a nice girl and get married because, like Emma, Reginald also longed for grandchildren. With Emma gone, the house was empty, and his days in retirement were lonely. Reginald would live to the age of 90, and there would be no little ones to come by for a visit. Instead, he only felt shame and misery at what would become of J. Montague Goolsbee in the years that followed. Dr. Goolsbee was a fine surgeon with a long list of patients throughout Yorkshire. Though his bedside manner was terrible, his services always were requested at various hospitals. He kept odd hours, but since he lived alone, he bothered no one and rarely slept. He ate one meal a day with a cup of black coffee in the morning. It was always the same: one poached egg and a piece of dry toast with an apple. He seemed more content sleeping in the day and staying up in the evening, keeping the schedule of a vampire when he could. He seldom slept more than 3 or 4 hours. Though he made a very good living as a highly skilled surgeon, Dr. Goolsbee was miserly with his money and lived a Spartan existence. His only financial indulgence was buying books to fill an impressive library which occupied the entire second floor of his home on Pittsmore Road, on the north edge of Sheffield, near the cemetery. It was an old house that spawned many local legends. Stories were told of the creepy doctor who lived alone in a big haunted house. Oddly, the legends weren't that far from the truth. Once that truth was known to the residents of Sheffield, jokes about the strange doctor didn't seem funny anymore. As he reached the age of 45, Dr. Goolsbee retired as a surgeon and began teaching at the University of Sheffield Medical School. The good doctor wanted to shape young medical minds with his knowledge and expertise. He was able to command the highest speaking fees of the medical doctors on staff due to his experience and the fact his lectures were always sold out. He would dissect cadavers and allow students to sit close by to learn what they had previously only known in textbooks. The University of Sheffield knew that keeping Dr. Goolsbee happy was the best way to continue filling their expensive medical school enrollment with the brightest and, most importantly, the wealthiest students. They were in constant competition with other prominent medical schools in London or Edinburgh, Scotland, which had become the epicenter of medical training in Europe at the time. There were also many private organizations providing anatomy classes throughout England. To attend a lecture of Dr. Goolsbee's, one would not expect the awkward man to command a high speaking fee. His delivery was monotone and haughty, and his voice had so much bass in it that it lulled students to sleep within minutes. It was the freshest of the cadavers that Dr. Goolsbee was able to deliver to the lecture hall that made him a hot commodity to the university. Even his rival, the suave and handsome Dr. Edward Dillswood, with his impressive London pedigree and vast surgical experience, was not able to put as many students in the lecture hall. Dr. Dillswood had his graduate assistants secretly follow Dr. Goolsbee to find out how he was able to get such fresh bodies to the tables, but no answers came. Only more questions mounted. Dr. Dillswood was not the only lecturer who wondered how Dr. Goolsbee was doing it. They all mocked his grim demeanor and deep, monotone voice, yet they all had tremendous envy at his ability to fill the lecture halls every week. There had been multiple accusations of questionable ethics cast in the direction of Dr. Goolsbee, but no proof was ever given or discovered. The administration of the university was made aware of this on more than one occasion, but no formal inquiries were made. It was as if those at the top of the academic food chain were more than willing to turn a blind eye to whatever methods Dr. J. Montague Goolsbee was utilizing to work his magic. They only saw the bottom line and buried their collective heads, pretending there was nothing of concern with Dr. Goolsbee's character. What nobody wanted to talk about in the medical field at the time was the practice of using body snatchers or resurrectionists who stole cadavers from cemeteries and sold them to the highest bidder. There was a huge demand for these bodies and a very limited supply. Cadavers coming from executions were divided up by the College of Surgeons. It wouldn't be until 1832 that laws were changed to make more cadavers available for medical research. In the meantime, this created an industry for the dregs of society to take up as body snatchers for the highest bidder. Most of them were lifelong criminals with drinking problems. Gangs of body snatchers would follow funeral processions and often fight each other for control of the corpse. They stood to make a good wage doing this, and it wasn't illegal at the time, provided they didn't steal any of the belongings buried with the dead. So the jewelry and clothing were often left behind for the more valuable commodity of flesh and bone. The shelf life was brief for those making a living from the dead. Once the bodies were 4 to 6 weeks old, the doctors weren't interested. The highest bidders were typically the doctors who gave anatomy lectures on a regular basis and charged the students an additional fee beyond their tuition to the school. They were in fierce competition with each other, and whoever could deliver the freshest bodies on a consistent basis would be the top earner. In the case of the University of Sheffield Medical School, that was Dr. J. Montague Goolsbee, the most unlikely doctor to be filling the seats with students. No one knew how he was able to get his bony hands on 1 or 2 fresh corpses each week during the fall and spring semester, and typically 1 or 2 a month for his special summer lectures for other medical doctors who were looking to better their skills as anatomists and surgeons. It was an exciting time in medicine, and these doctors were literally on the cutting edge of discoveries. Cemeteries were taking stern measures to prevent the theft of their residents by building watchtowers staffed with armed guards, or devising mort safes to cover the graves with heavy steel cages. Some families purchased iron coffins. The wealthy were able to put their dead in mausoleums that could be securely locked up. In some cases, the families and friends of the dead would hide in the woods outside the cemeteries in hopes to catch anyone in the act of resurrecting. These unfortunate body snatchers would ironically end up being sold to doctors themselves for use in anatomy classes, but at a discounted rate due to their poor condition. Dr. Goolsbee turned 46 on October 13, 1824. And that was when he required the services of the resurrection men. He met a rather rough character, Thomas O'Grady, after a lecture he attended on anatomy at the University of Sheffield. He was originally from London, but had to move his operation north to avoid some people he had done business with. Resurrection men had to bribe, steal, and connive their way to getting the cadavers. He was a burly man in his 30s with dark eyes, giant hands, and a flat nose. His curly black hair peered from beneath the cap he wore as he introduced himself, looking around to be sure no one could hear him. "I can get my hands on bodies, if you're in the market for any, good doctor," Thomas said in a rough but quiet voice, his smile revealing 2 missing teeth. "Nice and fresh, if I say so myself." Dr. Goolsbee seemed taken aback by the shifty stranger, who had overheard him ask a few questions of the lecturer after the seminar was over. Thomas O'Grady was good at looking for prospective clients. He was one of several resurrection men in the Yorkshire area at the time, though he was new to the area and looking to build his client base. "I'm not sure if I know what you mean, sir," Dr. Goolsbee said, cocking his head slightly and looking through the bottom of his spectacles. The 2 men spoke for several minutes. Then Dr. Goolsbee scheduled a meeting at his office after normal business hours so they could discuss the details. After his initial visit, Thomas was instructed to conduct any further business with the doctor at his home on Pittsmore Road. He made regular weekly visits there when Dr. Goolsbee began performing lectures in January of 1825. The doctor took deliveries of fresh cadavers at 4 a.m. each Sunday when the inquisitive weren't keeping an eye on his actions. He never asked any questions of Thomas O'Grady, who claimed he had arrangements with lodging houses throughout Yorkshire to purchase their deceased tenants. Dr. Goolsbee paid £10 for an adult and $5 for the body of a child, which was slightly more than the going rate. He made a deal with Thomas not to sell his cadavers to any of the other lecturers at University of Sheffield Medical School. Dr. Goolsbee quickly learned the coded vocabulary of the resurrection men. An adult was called a large, and a child was a small. They also referred to the cadavers as things, so when they were discussing business, it wouldn't be easy to decipher their true intent. While it wasn't illegal, the resurrection men were not looked at in a positive way, nor were the doctors who paid for their services. Families of loved ones were furious when graves were violated, and it often led to violence. The best of the resurrection men were able to stay far from the purview of the police and grieving families to earn a good living. The problem with most of them was their love of drinking alcohol, which was often the reason they got into fights and were thrown in jail on a regular basis. Or worse, they would get drunk and tell the wrong person what line of work they were in. Dr. Goolsbee secretly found it rather exciting to be in the resurrection business, despite his dislike of Thomas O'Grady. He considered the man uncouth and disliked the way he stunk of cheap cigars and body odor. In contrast, Dr. Goolsbee took 2 baths a day and kept himself impeccably clean at all times. He neurotically washed his hands on the hour, no matter what he was doing. His house was so well kept, the few visitors he had doubted anyone actually lived there. The doctor was making a lot of money with the arrangement, so he considered Thomas O'Grady an acceptable burden. He did greatly enjoy getting under the skin of his rival, Dr. Dillswood, who continued to send his assistants to follow him home from work or watch from the woods that surrounded his home. For the first 6 months of their arrangement, Thomas was able to provide him with fresh cadavers, and things were going well at the university with his lectures. For 2 consecutive weeks in May of 1825, Thomas failed to bring any cadavers for his usual Sunday morning drop-off. This was a concern, since the semester was almost over and he was hoping to finish his lecture strong. The last thing he wanted was any of the other doctors to surpass his attendance records. The doctor was concerned about looking into the services of the other body snatchers. It might draw unwanted attention. He knew there were several resurrection men in Yorkshire, but he didn't want to talk to the other doctors about how they were getting their cadavers. The university had to fill the lecture halls with fresh flowers and spices to disguise the smell of the decomposing bodies. They used fans and did what they could to mask the unpleasant odor. The worse it was, the fewer students signed up. Using other resurrection men would mean having to settle for substandard research cadavers that were much more decomposed. It would also put him at tremendous risk for those who were following his every move, like Dr. Dillswood and his brood of assistants. He needed to keep his methods all to himself. It was better that he wait and hope Thomas would return in time for the summer lecture season. It was July of 1825, and Dr. Goolsbee had given up on the resurrectionist Thomas O'Grady. He believed the ruffian had gotten himself in trouble with the law and was in prison, or possibly discovered retrieving a corpse and murdered by an angry mob of family members. In either case, Thomas was no good to him, and he needed to do something. The university did obtain a few cadavers from the College of Surgeons, but those were divided between lecturers. It wasn't enough, and he began to notice a decline in his attendance as compared to when Thomas was bringing him a fresh body every week. It was impacting his earning potential and concerned him a great deal, especially now that he was fully retired as a surgeon and only working at the university. An idea came to Dr. J. Montague Goolsbee when he was eating his breakfast one morning that July. It would change his life dramatically. Oddly, it was the resounding snap of a mousetrap he set behind the stove that became his muse. He had seen the disgusting creature scurry across his immaculately kept kitchen floor for a few days and was furious over it. He vowed that he would kill it and rid his house of the vermin. He rarely saw mice at the house, despite the fact he was surrounded by woods. He refused to get a cat like most people did who lived in the country. He despised them since childhood and didn't think they were much better than having a mouse in his home. He jumped up from his seat at the kitchen table when he heard the trap had sprung. In a rare showing of emotion, the doctor was giddy with excitement. "I got you, you little bastard," Dr. Goolsbee said, setting his coffee cup down. He cautiously peered behind the stove where the mousetrap was sprung and was pleased to see the small brown mouse dead, its legs stretched out and tiny mouth slightly open. A small amount of blood was on the floor where the metal trap landed on its vile head. It disgusted Dr. Goolsbee, but he was happy the creature was deceased, and he used an old rag to pick up the trap and clean up the mess. After he threw it away in the garbage can outside, he washed his hands twice and sat back down to finish his coffee. That's when the idea came to him. The idea was a culmination of his need for more cadavers, his incredibly frugal nature, and the desire to outdo the other professors, namely Dr. Dillswood. Rather than waiting around for the irresponsible and unsavory resurrection men, Dr. Goolsbee would take matters into his own hands, literally. Well, not exactly. He would need some help to pull off his plan, but if things went just right, he would have a steady supply of cadavers for the last part of his summer lecture series and into the foreseeable future. Part 3. 1 month later. It was the night of August 5th, 1825, and Dr. Goolsbee sat in his office at the University of Sheffield. He tapped his right forefinger on his desk and stared out into the night through a small window. For a Friday, he was there much later than usual. It was just before classes started up again, so there was no one around. Earlier, he met with two of his graduate assistants that were recruited specifically for this new idea, which came to him when the mousetrap was sprung a month before. The first one that came to mind was a brilliant young medical student from Germany, Louis Friedhoff. He was a rotund young man who was barely 5'6" tall, with curly blonde hair he kept short. His English was excellent, though he had a striking German accent. Louis was studying in England as part of a gifted student exchange and was lodging in a 2-story home the university owned for international students. His family back in Germany were dairy farmers and struggled to pay his tuition, so he was very grateful to have a job with Dr. Goolsbee. He came from a large family of 8 children and grew up doing physical hard labor on the family farm. It was unusual that he was so chubby working on a farm, but he ate like 3 young men and packed on the extra weight since he was studying in England. He was not about to ruin his chance to earn his Doctor of Medicine free of charge at a reputable school as the University of Sheffield. Louis didn't flinch when he found out what Dr. Goolsbee had expected him to do. The other graduate assistant was the opposite physically of Louis. Ian Michael Grimm was a tall, thin, young man who was originally from the working-class city of Birmingham. He was nearly as tall as Dr. Goolsbee, and the rings around his eyes and gaunt face would make a person wonder if the two were actually related. He also wore round-rimmed glasses and kept his brown hair slicked back like the professor. Ian was very intelligent and came from modest means, spending his teenage years in an orphanage since his parents were killed in a terrible fire at the textile factory where they both worked. Ian excelled in his studies and made it to the University of Sheffield on a scholarship. 4 years later, he was accepted in the medical school because of his excellent grades and work ethic. Like Louis, Ian needed a job working as a graduate assistant to pay his medical school tuition. Dr. Goolsbee thought Ian was a good choice to work with Louis on this special assignment that paid more than any of the other graduate assistant positions. As cheap as Dr. Goolsbee was, he was willing to pay for their silence and agreement to do the job he asked. Due to the scope of their duties, Dr. Goolsbee was funding their salaries himself. Upon their graduation, Dr. Goolsbee planned to release them from the agreement and give both glowing letters of recommendation. Ian was surprised when Dr. Goolsbee explained what they would be doing, but seemed fine with the arrangement nonetheless. Dr. Goolsbee purchased a horse-drawn carriage that was used for the transportation of ice at the time in England. He bought it from an old farmer who was retiring and selling the horse and carriage to fund a move to Ireland. The back of it was insulated and fully enclosed instead of an open passenger compartment. Louis had experience with horses from his family farm in southern Bavaria, which was helpful. He also purchased uniforms for the 2 young men and repainted ice on the sides of the carriage and across the rear double doors. This would be the perfect cover for what he had in mind. 2 patients owed Dr. Goolsbee money for medical services rendered, and he used the money to purchase the horse and ice carriage. There was paint left behind at his office after some work the maintenance crew completed before he moved in. He brought it home to do the job. The ever-resourceful Dr. J. Montague Goolsbee was able to pay for everything, including food for the horses, with money that was owed to him and some leftover white paint. The money he would save not having to hire the services of the resurrection men was more than enough to divide between Louis and Ian, with a little left over for himself. Ian and Louis left to go out and perform their debut mission, while Dr. Goolsbee sat in his office, gazing nervously out the window. Both men were sworn to secrecy, and since the doctor had the upper hand on each, given their need to earn money to complete their MDs, He felt the risk was minimal. Plus, he would not be with them and could just deny any involvement. The doctor would say he hired the two men to deliver ice and nothing more. There would be some ice in the carriage to make the whole thing appear legitimate. Part 4. Ian and Lewis sat in the ice carriage waiting in an alley off Broomhall Street, just as Dr. Goolsbee had told them to do. They had been there about 30 minutes on a humid August night. Their instructions were very clear. They had rehearsed the details many times. "How long do you expect we'll have to be here? It's warm tonight," Lewis said, peering from beneath the brim of the hat he wore as part of their uniform. His stomach grumbled from not eating dinner before they left. "I'm not sure, mate," Ian said. "I guess as long as it takes." Suddenly, a prostitute staggered down the lit street into the darkness of the alley. She wore a red and black dress, gray stockings, and ankle-high boots. The dress seemed too small for her full figure, and her breasts were peeking out of the bustier she wore. Dr. Goolsbee told them prostitutes were common in that area of town. There were 2 cheap lodging houses nearby the women rented by the hour to satisfy their customers. Dr. Goolsbee explained prostitutes and homeless people were ideal targets since they were transient by nature and less likely to be missed by loved ones. "Hey, lads, you looking for some company tonight, are you?" the woman asked. She was missing 2 teeth and looked like she was at least twice their age. "The name's Holly," she said with a slight slur in her speech, and her breath reeked of alcohol. She placed a hand on the carriage to steady herself. Ian smiled. He was the designated spokesman of the two. "Well, yes, we are, madam." "Both of you?" "Yes." "Give him your hand," Ian said. Lewis helped her onto the front bench seat of the carriage as Ian took out a flask of whiskey that Dr. Goolsbee gave them. He handed it to Holly, who seemed surprised they offered it to her. She was used to selling herself for a few quid if she was lucky, just enough to pay for her food, lodging, and to drink herself to sleep with the strongest whiskey she could find. Anything to dull the pain of her existence. After losing 2 children in a house fire and a husband to a farming accident, she had nothing to live for. "Don't mind if I do, boys," Holly said, taking a long pull from the flask. It burned going down, but she liked it that way. It took her mind off the pain for a few moments. Ian and Lewis watched her take a long drink. They both sized up the older woman and thought about what Dr. Goolsbee told them to do. They rid their minds of any sympathy, thinking of it in a positive way, like shooting a horse with a broken leg. Dr. Goolsbee put it to them that way. In his mind, the doctor thought about the unlucky mouse in his kitchen and how he put the disgusting thing out of its misery. "No problem at all, miss. Drink as much as you want. We've got plenty more," Ian said, grabbing a hold of her by the arm while Lewis took the right. The 2 men quickly had her down on the floor in front of the bench seat. In seconds, Ian placed his hand over her mouth to stifle her screams, and with his other hand pinched her nose shut. Her eyes were open wide in terror at the realization of what was happening to her. She wanted to breathe, but was unable. Before Holly could escape, Lewis sat down on her chest. He used his girth to pin her to the floor. Her legs flailed, but soon lost their power as Ian's steady grip on her nose and mouth suffocated the woman. Within a couple of minutes, she lay lifeless on the floor of the carriage. It went easier than both men imagined. In the darkness of the alley, the men placed Holly in the back of the carriage behind a row of large ice blocks. They covered her body with burlap sacks so no one would be the wiser should the roving eye of a policeman peer inside. All of this was part of their instructions from the doctor. Without another word, they rode the carriage out to Dr. Goolsbee's home on Pittsmore Road by the old cemetery. Ian whistled an old English drinking song, and then sang quietly as they made their way down the cobblestone streets of Sheffield. The hooves of the horse seemed to keep him in time. "Come, all ye bold fellows that have to this place come, and we'll sing in the praise of good brandy and rum. Let's lift up our glasses, good cheer is our goal. Bring in the punch ladle, we'll fathom the bowl." Part 5. Once the young men arrived at Dr. Goolsbee's home, they were instructed to pull the carriage around back to a small barn on the north side of the property. Once inside, Ian and Lewis picked up the body and placed it in a small room the doctor had them build the week before. It was lined with bales of hay, and there were blocks of ice inside, where the cadavers would be stored inside large burlap sacks. "So how did it go?" Dr. Goolsbee asked in the dim glow of a lantern he carried. "Just as you said it would, sir," Ian said. Dr. Goolsbee responded with a thin smile. That was the most emotion one could expect to see from him. This would conclude the first mission of Ian and Lewis. As expected, the men followed Dr. Goolsbee's instructions flawlessly. They were paid the fee agreed upon and were on their way back to the university to sleep after a busy night out. Dr. Goolsbee locked up the small room in his barn and walked back to the house, washing his hands twice before retiring to bed. He was very pleased. Each of the men found it difficult to fall asleep after what they had done. There was no turning back now. Part 6. Over the course of the next 8 months, Ian and Lewis managed to repeat the same procedure an astounding 18 times in Sheffield and some of the surrounding towns in Yorkshire. Dr. Goolsbee had plenty of cadavers to astound his students, the other professors, as well as the administration. It didn't seem to bother anyone the bodies were so fresh and showed none of the telltale signs they were snatched from the grave. After all, it was Dr. J. Montague Goolsbee that was receiving the bodies, and the 2 graduate assistants would help him prepare them for dissection. The bodies showed no obvious signs they had been murdered. There were no limitations on what a medical examiner could discern when the cause of death was suffocation. No one was asking questions of Dr. Goolsbee or the other professors in order to benefit from plausible deniability. They were all using the services of resurrection men at Sheffield University and throughout Europe. Everyone except Dr. Goolsbee. He was his own resurrection man, and his hubris was growing by the day. He was even starting to smile a little more, especially when he thought about how much money he was making. Yet beyond the benefit of the financial gain, Dr. Goolsbee was getting under the skin of his nemesis, the handsome Dr. Edward Dillswood. Part of it was a release of the pent-up anger he had growing up looking the way he did in a world so cruel and obsessed with facade. Not to mention the way his own parents shunned him, desperately trying to force him to do things he didn't want to do, instead of loving him for who he was. For the first time in his life, Dr. Goolsbee felt alive and at the top of his game. It was April of 1826, and there was 1 month left of classes. There were 2 cadavers on ice in the barn, and Dr. Goolsbee calculated he would need 4 more to get him through to the fall semester. At the rate Ian and Lewis were going, they could easily get that done, and he would give them a month off. He wanted to pay them well and give them some time to themselves. He needed Ian and Lewis to keep this operation going like it was. It was a cost of doing business, and without them, the whole thing would collapse. Dr. Goolsbee felt confident when it came time to negotiate his speaking fees in June that he would be able to increase them by 25% or more. He was shattering any attendance records the university had ever seen for the anatomy and dissection lectures. They had to move him to a larger hall that was typically used for large assemblies at the school. If things continued like this, he would be able to retire at 55 and live comfortably on his savings, investments, and the university pension. He thought maybe he would like to travel the world and speak at select medical conferences to stay relevant, possibly write an autobiography. Dr. Dillswood was beside himself with jealousy. He secretly met with 3 of the other professors in the department to discuss the peculiar Dr. Goolsbee. They all knew the small circle of resurrection men that the professors used, and none of them were working for Dr. Goolsbee. They knew he had to be up to no good, but there was not a shred of evidence to prove it. He gave Dr. Dillswood the creeps from the first time he laid eyes on the strange, gaunt man with dark rings around his eyes and an almost gray pallor. The slight hunch in his back added to the mysterious look of the doctor in black. The professors all laughed when Dr. Dillswood referred to Dr. Goolsbee as an undertaker and joked he looked more like a cadaver than the bodies he was dissecting. The truth was, Dr. Dillswood was furious, and he couldn't figure out what to do. The other professors didn't offer any suggestions. It was beginning to have a serious impact on his sleep, marriage, and overall demeanor. The usual suave and sophisticated doctor was starting to unravel. The entire staff of professors used their capable graduate assistants to follow Dr. Goolsbee around in a discreet way. They worked in shifts, with someone keeping an eye on him as much as possible. On several occasions, they observed Dr. Goolsbee's house from the dense woods that surrounded it. It was set off Pittsmore Road about 800 meters, down a winding gravel driveway lined with large oak trees. They couldn't get close enough to see what was inside, and he rarely left the house. The curtains were always drawn tightly. Dr. Dillswood talked to his wife, and she suggested he go see the police chief, Captain Ned Howell. Ned was a sensible man, and they knew each other well. They attended church together and had children about the same age. "Ned, there's something strange going on. I need you to do me a favor," Dr. Dillswood said, drinking a pint of beer with the police chief at a local Sheffield pub. He went on to tell Ned his suspicions about the cadavers that Dr. Goolsbee seemed to always have on hand. "I can have my men take a look around and see what we can come up with," Ned said, before he finished the rest of his pint. He smacked his lips. Dr. Dillswood smiled and ordered them 2 more. "I appreciate it. I think if you dig hard enough, we just might find out what Dr. J. Montague Goolsbee has been up to for more than a year." Both men laughed. Part 7. A week after the meeting between Dr. Dillswood and Captain Ned Howell, Dr. Goolsbee began to notice a stronger police presence around the university. They seemed to be spending quite a bit of time at the medical school, speaking to the other professors, secretaries, and administration. Dr. Goolsbee found it odd that none of the police officers came to talk with him. He began to fear that something or someone had tipped them off about his operation. Dr. Goolsbee felt confident that Ian and Lewis had not revealed their secret, especially since it would lead them both to the gallows for committing the murders. He had a rehearsed story ready should anyone ask him about where he was getting the fresh bodies. He would make the claim that Thomas O'Grady did. He would say that he had arrangements with the lodging houses to get their cadavers, since they were typically dealing with older citizens, the poor, transients, and people who were drinking themselves to death. The truth is, he did have arrangements with them to pick up their dead, and he was giving them a finder's fee for the business. Dr. Goolsbee had woven quite the web to cover bases, should questions come up. He expected they would, eventually, and wanted to be prepared. He also had Gregory Q. Marlett, the best solicitor in Yorkshire, on retainer should the need arise. One night at his house, Dr. Goolsbee thought he saw a man coming up the driveway on foot. The doctor was sure he saw someone, but no one was there moments later. The following morning, Dr. Goolsbee was eating his breakfast at the kitchen table and thought he saw a policeman gazing into his window. When he jumped up to get a better look, the man was gone and nowhere to be found. He was certain he saw the man. Dr. Goolsbee was concerned about the shortage of the cadavers with 2 more scheduled lectures before the end of the semester. These were attended by students who paid extra for the chance to dissect a cadaver for themselves, and the doctor would make a lot more money. These worries were affecting his sleep, and he found himself looking out the windows often. He decided it best to not send Ian and Lewis out for a while, just to be certain he was not under investigation. He would use the cadaver on ice in the barn for the last 2 lectures and hoped the men could resume their activities soon. He hated to keep Ian and Lewis idle, but he knew it was far better than the police finding out about what they had been doing. They would all hang for their deeds, including Dr. J. Montague Goolsbee. Even worse than a death by the hangman would be publicly tarnishing his impeccable name. He knew Dr. Dillswood would enjoy that entirely too much. Reading the Sheffield Daily Telegraph the following day, Dr. Goolsbee found a notice that a 62-year-old woman, Mrs. Abigail Peterson, had died of natural causes at her home in nearby Doncaster. What had caught his eye was the mention that the services would be at Pittsmore Cemetery on October 30th. That was the graveyard down the road from his house. They didn't seem to bury people there often. In the last 20 years he had lived nearby, Dr. Goolsbee could only think of a handful. There were cemeteries closer in town that were more commonly used. The article went on to say that there were many Petersons buried at Pittsmore Cemetery, and Abigail would be placed in the family plot on the north end. Dr. Goolsbee wondered if any of the resurrection men would come out to the old cemetery to try and retrieve Mrs. Peterson after the burial. There were no watchtowers or night guards on duty there. He had never observed the popular mort safes some families were using to keep the body snatchers away. Dr. Goolsbee thought about it while he drank his black coffee that morning. He stared out the window and thought about his next move. 2 days later, the answer came while he drank his morning coffee. There was an article in the newspaper that made the doctor smirk. Abigail Peterson was the daughter of a retired policeman with the Sheffield Police Department, and there would be many of the top brass from Sheffield and the surrounding towns at the funeral. Dr. Goolsbee knew that the family member of a retired police officer would be the last person a resurrection man with a brain would pursue. This just might be the perfect opportunity for him to swoop in and have his assistants get Mrs. Peterson. Dr. Goolsbee had Ian and Lewis meet at his house the day after the funeral. As the newspaper predicted, there was quite the procession the day before at the cemetery for the burial of Abigail Peterson. Every police officer in the surrounding area was at the funeral. Her son was very respected as a police sergeant in Leeds, and her father was well known throughout Yorkshire, even in retirement. Now that all the crowd was gone, the old cemetery was nice and quiet once again. It was 11 p.m. on October 31st, 1826, and Dr. Goolsbee sat at his kitchen table with Ian and Lewis. They were all dressed in black. "I've decided to go out with you tonight," Dr. Goolsbee said, looking sternly at both of them. "Really? Are you sure that's a good idea, Doctor?" Ian said. "Yes, I think it would be best for me to be there as a lookout. You'll both be busy digging, but with the fresh earth, I expect it shouldn't take you both but an hour to have the casket open. You might need me to help you get her out of the hole, depending on how deep it is." Dr. Goolsbee was sure to give them both a detailed plan of what was about to transpire. The fact he was going with them was a new spin on the system that had worked well before. Lewis was concerned that they were doing things differently and had some religious reservations about digging up the dead. Oddly, he seemed fine with murdering 20 people by sitting on the unsuspecting victims while Ian smothered them. The hypocrisy was rich. They drove the ice carriage to the cemetery and parked it in a cluster of trees that Dr. Goolsbee scouted out days before. The horse was tied up. It would be difficult to explain why two young men were delivering ice at the remote cemetery at midnight. If things went as planned, Dr. Goolsbee felt that they would be able to get Mrs. Peterson to the carriage and have her on ice in the barn before anyone would miss her. It didn't take them long to find the burial site on the north end of the small cemetery. In the cool October air, there was a thin fog that blanketed the area. Ian and Lewis brought the shovels and began the slow work of unearthing the corpse. Every sound seemed magnified at midnight in such a desolate place. Ian paused for a moment, thinking he heard a noise coming from the wooded area on the west side of the cemetery. It gave him the chills being there at night like this. While he wasn't as religious as Lewis, it seemed terrible to desecrate the grave, especially under a full moon that beamed overhead. Dr. Goolsbee noticed that the shoveling was making more noise than he planned for, as each shovelful of dirt was mixed with gravel. This was a common method cemeteries used to act as a sort of alarm that someone was digging where they shouldn't be. He knew there were no houses closer than his, so he wasn't concerned someone would hear the shoveling. It just surprised him. Despite the fact the men were being careful, they were making a lot of noise. Several shovelfuls later, Lewis stopped. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Dr. Goolsbee was staring off to the west. He heard it too, and held up his hand to motion them to stop at what they were doing. It sounded like a branch snapped. With the shoveling ceased, it was distinct. "Stay still, gentlemen," Dr. Goolsbee whispered, holding his forefinger to his lips as he crouched down to a knee, surrounded by the fog. Ian and Lewis did the same. They waited silently with Dr. Goolsbee as the night seemed to swallow them up. The full moon above cast the entire scene in a strange yellow hue. They could sense eyes watching them from somewhere in the west. The feeling was unnerving. Another branch broke, this time from the north side. It was much closer. The three men were crouched down below the fog, hoping it would make them invisible to whatever was hunting them. It felt like they were being stalked. Each of the men had the same sensation. Now, as another branch broke, they felt a presence in the darkness inching closer. Dr. Goolsbee looked over his shoulder at Pittsmore Road and the area where they had hid the horse and carriage, but it was concealed by the blanket of fog that seemed to be thickening as the minutes ticked by. Suddenly, the north end of the cemetery was illuminated, and the three men stood up, dumbfounded at what was going on. They shielded their faces from the fiery glow coming from them at all sides. "We will advise you men to stop what you're doing," a male voice said. He was holding a torch and walking toward them from the north. The three men looked to the west as others were coming toward them with lit torches, the fires flickering as they closed in. There were a lot of them, and they meant business. Dr. Goolsbee could feel his heartbeat thundering in his chest. How could this be? How long had these men been hiding in wait? "I am Dr. J. Montague Goolsbee, and these are my students. "We are here on university business," the doctor said with a nervous confidence. His voice wavered and was ignored by the group as they moved closer. "And we are the friends and family of Mrs. Abigail Peterson. We are here to put a stop at what you heathens are doing. You will not desecrate this grave tonight, Dr. Goolsbee." Slowly, a crowd of 40 friends and family closed in on the three, their faces covered with disgust and hatred for what they were witnessing. They had been warned the resurrectionists would come to retrieve another cadaver, but they didn't believe it until they saw it with their collective eyes. These men were armed and ready to exact revenge on the body snatchers. Most of them were men of the law that were not at the cemetery in an official capacity. They were judge, jury, and executioners on this night. They would remain anonymous and not speak of what was about to happen. Dr. Goolsbee, Ian, and Lewis closed ranks and knelt down shaking, their arms interlocked to shield themselves from the impending attack. Bones crunched and blood soaked the ground as the men were pummeled with axes, knives, clubs, and bare fists until they would become fair game for the resurrection men or wild animals, whichever claimed their wretched bodies first. "And my prentices will surely come and carve me bone from bone, and I, who have rifled the dead man's grave, shall never rest in my own." 1822 advertisement for Bridgman's Iron Coffins, the surgeon's warning. If you liked what you just heard, then go to my website, petealtieri.com. Creation of Chaos Volume 4. It's packed with 11 new stories, plus 2 from my old days as a teenage author, unedited. Cover artwork from Brian Usual is the perfect touch to make this book a great one. You get your copy signed by me, plus a free 11 by 17 poster and bookmark. So go to petealtieri.com and get yours today. I'll link to it in the episode description, and you can also get there by going to creationofchaos.com. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you around next time.
Mother, man.